Feedback. You ever notice how someone can seem really into you one moment, deeply connected, enjoying your company, laughing, flirting, being physically affectionate, and then out of nowhere, feedback. They begin to retreat. They become distant, cold, unavailable. It leaves you confused, hurt, and questioning everything you thought was building between the two of you. Feedback. And what makes it more perplexing, at the moment you start letting go, when you begin to move on or focus on yourself, they suddenly reappear. Feedback. Almost as if your absence flipped some switch in their brain. And this pattern, if you've ever been on the receiving end of it, can be maddening. So why does this happen? Well, feedback. It starts with understanding how someone with an avoidant attachment style operates emotionally. For avoidance, intimacy doesn't feel like a warm, safe space to fall into. It feels like pressure. Feedback. It feels like a threat to their independence, their autonomy, their emotional balance. See, an avoidant isn't avoiding you. Feedback. They're avoiding the uncomfortable feelings that emotional closeness tends to bring up them. Closeness stirs up vulnerability. And for them, vulnerability is deeply unsettling because feedback. Somewhere along the way, maybe early in life, they learn that depending on others leads to pain, disappointment, or abandonment. So they form this strategy. Don't get too close. Feedback. Don't rely. Don't need too much. And definitely don't let anyone else need too much from you. When they first meet someone new, there's a lot of excitement. That early spark, feedback, that chemistry, it's intoxicating. And in those early stages, it doesn't feel dangerous to get close because there's still enough space, enough novelty, feedback, enough room to fantasize without yet confronting the realities of intimacy. But as things get more emotionally intimate, they start to feel something creeping in back. The walls they've built to protect themselves start shaking a bit. Your affection, your presence, your emotional availability, they begin to register not just as connection, but as pressure, feedback. Suddenly it's, whoa, this person is starting to expect things of me. This person might start needing me. Feedback. I might start needing them. And that's when the avoidance starts to subconsciously pull back. Not because you did something wrong, not because you're too intense or too emotional. Feedback. But because closeness feels like a risk they're not sure they're ready to take. So what do? They create space. They withdraw emotionally or physically. They become inconsistent. Feedback. They stop showing up in the way they were in the beginning. And here's the cruel twisting as they pull away. Feedback. You being a human who was just starting to trust this connection, naturally move close, try to bridge the gap. You send the thoughtful messages, try to get time together. Feedback. Check in to see what's wrong. And the more you reach, the more it confirms their fear that closeness equals pressure. So they back away even further. It's a self-perpetuating cycle. Feedback. The more they pull away, the more you try to hold on, the more suffocated they feel. And in their mind, the only solution is to create even more distance. Feedback. Until eventually it reaches a breaking point. Now, here's where it gets interesting. You, exhausted and confused, finally get to a point where you emotionally detach. Maybe you stop texting. Feedback. Maybe you begin focusing back on your life, your friendships, your goals. Maybe even start dating someone else. And just as you start doing that, guess who shows up again? Why? Feedback. Because your distance did something their closeness couldn't. It removed the threat. With you no longer energetically pursuing them, they feel like they can breathe again. Feedback. You're no longer trying to pull them into the deep end, so they don't have to swim away. And in that calm, with the emotional pressure gone, they can actually start to miss you. Feedback. They start to remember the good things, the connection, the way you made them feel. But because they weren't emotionally safe enough to let themselves appreciate it, while you were present. Feedback. They can only long for it when you're gone. And it's not the feelings weren't real before, they were. But they couldn't coexist with their fear of intimacy at the same time. Feedback. That's the conflict they're constantly trying to navigate. Wanting love, but fearing the vulnerability it requires. So when they come back, feedback, it's often not because they've had some profound realization and are now ready to be emotionally available. It's because the dynamic shifted. Feedback. They feel safer approaching when they don't feel chased. Feedback. But unless something changes in how they process intimacy, and unless you change how you respond to their hot and cold behavior, the cycle is likely to repeat itself. Feedback. And that's the hardest truth of all. Their attraction to you never left. It was just buried beneath a fear they didn't know how to face. Feedback. What's fascinating, and honestly a bit ironic, is how often someone with an avoidant attachment style becomes more attracted to you the moment you step back. The second you stop calling. Feedback. Stop chasing, stop checking in on them, they show up again. It makes you wonder, why now? Why are they more interested when I finally stop trying? Well, feedback. The answer is rooted in something we often forget when emotions are involved. People don't just respond to our presence, they also respond to our absence. When you were reaching out, feedback, emotionally available, showing up consistently, they felt something that avoidants are incredibly sensitive to: pressure. Not because you were doing anything wrong, but because in their mind, feedback, intimacy quickly becomes overwhelming. Your kindness, your desire for connection, all beautiful things, start to feel like expectations they're not ready to meet. feedback, not because they don't care, because they associate emotional closeness with losing themselves. Now, here's where it gets subtle. While they're pulling away feedback, they often convince themselves they're doing what's best, that maybe they need space, that things were moving too fast, that they're just not ready for anything serious. And in the process, feedback, they start to create this emotional vacuum. They detach to regain their sense of freedom, to recalibrate. And during this phase, it can feel like they've completely lost interest. Feedback, even though that's rarely the full truth. Then something shifts. You stop showing up. You stop texting just to check in. You're not waiting by your phone anymore. Feedback. Maybe you've started investing your energy into your own life, your friends, your passions, your peace. And in doing that, without even meaning to, feedback, you remove the emotional weight they were struggling under. You stop being the one holding the emotional rope, and they feel that. They feel the space. And here's what that space does, feedback. It creates room for them to feel their own emotions. When you were always there, they didn't have to miss you. They didn't have to wonder what you were doing or who you were thinking about. Feedback. You were predictable. And while that kind of consistency is incredibly healthy in secure relationships, to someone avoidant, it can feel like too much, too fast. But when you step back, that emotional air clears, the noise of their defensiveness fades. And now in that silence and in that something unexpected begins to surface. Longing, feedback. Now they start to remember the way you made them feel, the way your presence grounded them, even if they couldn't fully appreciate it in the moment. But more than that, they feel the contrast, feedback, because in your absence, they aren't just remembering you, they're noticing what they no longer have access to. That steady, loving energy that used to be there, it's gone, feedback. And in its place is this uneasy quiet they didn't expect. And here's the part that catches them off guarding. They liked feeling important to you, even if they didn't know how to handle it. Feedback. They liked knowing that someone cared enough to try. And now that you're not reaching anymore, they start to question whether they might have made a mistake by pushing you away. Feedback. It's important to understand that this isn't necessarily a conscious process. They don't sit down and go, wow, I was emotionally unavailable back, and now I see the error of my ways. No. It's usually subtle, a thought that crosses their mind when something reminds them of you, a feeling of emptiness they can't quite explain. Model feedback, that little emotional itch that tells them something's missing, and maybe, just maybe, that something was actually someone. So what do? They come back, feedback. Maybe they send a text out of nowhere. Maybe they watch your Instagram story and don't say anything. Maybe they say they were just thinking of you, or they make a weak excuse to reconnect. Feedback. And it's easy to confuse this with growth. It's easy to think they must finally be ready. They realize they care. And in some cases that might be true, but more often feedback. What they're responding to isn't some new level of emotional maturity. It's the relief they feel now that you're no longer emotional leaning in. Your distance makes them feel safe. Feedback. Because now they don't have to feel overwhelmed. They can re-engage on their terms when it feels comfortable for them. Feedback. And your silence, your emotional absence, does something your presence couldn't. It gives them the illusion of control again. But here's the danger. Back, if they haven't done the work to understand their own patterns, that attraction they feel for you now will likely fade again the moment you move closer. The cycle repeats. Feedback, because it's not just about missing you, it's about how they feel in the absence of emotional pressure, which means if you jump back in full of hope, feedback, hoping they're finally ready to meet you emotionally, you may find them retreating again. Feedback. And that's why it's so important to understand the difference between someone who misses you because they love you and someone who misses your absence, simply restored their comfort. One of the most fascinating things about avoidance, and honestly, feedback, one of the most frustrating, is how much more attractive you suddenly become to the moment you stop being emotionally available. It's like flipping a switch. Feedback. You go from being too much to suddenly being everything they can't stop thinking about. And you're sitting there going, where was this energy when I was actually there? Showing up. Feedback. Making an effort. And this is where the psychology of scarcity comes in. It's a very human response, not just an avoidant one, but avoidants feel it even more intensely. See, feedback. Something is always available. When someone is always showing up, answering the phone, replying to the message, initiating connection, it can start to feel, to someone with an avoidant lens, feedback, like they're losing their space, even if you're not trying to invade it. The consistency that makes you a secure and stable partner is misinterpreted as a potential threat to their independence. Feedback. And when they start to sense that they might be expected to show up at the same level, emotionally consistently, they begin to panic. So what do? They create emotional distance. Feedback. Sometimes they'll pull away quietly, and other times they'll actively say things like, I need space, or I'm not ready for anything serious. And in those moments, you might think feedback. Okay, fair enough, they're being honest. But what you don't see is that psychologically they're trying to re-establish a sense of control, feedback. They feel safe when they're not dependent on someone, and especially when they feel like no one is depending on either. But then something changes, you pull away, feedback. Maybe not even as a strategy, maybe it's just pure exhaustion. You've given all you try to train, you realize the imbalance in the dynamic, feedback, and you finally start to reclaim your time, your energy, your peace. Maybe you stop texting first, maybe you don't respond as quickly, maybe you just mentally check out, feedback, and suddenly the dynamic flips. You become scarce, and that scarcity hits differently. Now, you're no longer emotionally chasing them, feedback. You're no longer trying to fix things or show them how good the connection could be if only let it happen. You're just gone, or at least unavailable in the way you used to be. Feedback. And what happens? They start feeling your absence in a very real way because now they don't have access to you on their terms. They don't get to dip in and out whenever they please. Feedback. And that's when the attractions to resurface. It's not that you became more attractive overnight. It's that the conditions around you changed. Feedback. Your value didn't change, but their perception of it did. And that's because in a world full of endless options and emotional noise, feedback, something that feels slightly out of reach, becomes more desirable. It forces them to confront what they actually felt but weren't ready to face. C, feedback. Avoidants often suppress their feelings in real time. They compartmentalize. They convince themselves that what they had with you wasn't that deep or that they didn't need it. Feedback. But once you remove yourself from the equation, once you stop giving them the chance to keep one foot in, they're left with silence. And in that silence, they start to remember the warmth, feedback, the consistency, the way you made them feel. And that contrast between what they had and what they're now missing amplifies everything. Your absence creates a vacuum. And in that vacuum, feedback. Desire grows. That's the paradox of avoidance. They often need to lose access to truly feel the weight of what they had. Feedback. The emotional scarcity makes them suddenly value what they were taking for granted. Not because they're manipulative, not because they're playing games. Feedback. But because they're wired to associate distance with safety. When you were close, you represented emotional risk. Now that you're far, you feel emotionally safe to miss. Feedback. And you might think, well, if they're only interested when I pull away, isn't that unhealthy? And yes, absolutely, it can be. Feedback. But what's important to understand is that their response isn't about punishing you for caring. It's about their internal wiring, how they've been conditioned to interpret closeness. Feedback. So when your presence becomes rare, it's not about you being a trophy to win back. It's about them confronting feelings they couldn't access when they felt emotionally overwhelmed. Feedback. Scarcity forces them to value what was always there, but what they couldn't see clearly while it was right in front of them. Feedback. It's strange, isn't it? How someone can have something so emotionally fulfilling right in front of them. Someone who's kind, present, safe, and still feel the need to run from it. Feedback. And then later, sometimes much later, they circle back. And you're left wondering, why now? Why didn't you appreciate when you had it? But the truth is, feedback for someone with an avoidant attachment style, it's not about logic. It's not even about timming. It's about safety, emotional safety. And more specifically, the delayed realization of it. Feedback. When you're emotionally available and showing up consistently, it should be comforting. For someone who's secure or at least open to connection, it is. But for avoidance, feedback. That level of openness and closeness can feel like a weight, not because it's heavy in a negative way, but because it brings up fears they don't know how to sit with. Fears of being trapped, feedback, of being responsible for someone else's emotions, of losing their independence, or even of being hurt again. Deep down, they don't always trust that love can last without conditions, or that it one day turn into something painful, disappointing, or suffocating. Feedback. So even though your presence might have been the calmest thing they've ever experienced, they couldn't absorb it at the time. They couldn't see the safety in it. Feedback. Because they were too busy trying to defend themselves from a threat that only existed in their own emotional memory. That's the key. They weren't reacting to you. They were reacting to a story. Feedback. A story from past experiences, from the wounds that taught them that closeness equals danger. Maybe they had a parent who was emotionally unpredictable. Feedback. Maybe they learned early on that relying on someone leads to disappointment. So now, when someone comes close, even with the best of intentions, it feels like history repeating itself. Feedback. But here's where it gets interesting. When you leave, when you stop showing up the way you used to, when your warmth is no longer available to them on demand, suddenly there's no more threat, feedback. There's no emotional pressure. You're not asking anything of them. You're not requiring vulnerability. And in that absence, feedback. The thing they couldn't recognize as safety, when it was right in front of them, becomes clear. They start to miss what they couldn't feel before. Feedback. They start to long for the very thing they once rejected. And it's not because you changed. It's because their nervous system isn't under threat anymore. It's calm. And in that calm, feedback, their defenses go down just enough for the truth to come up. The truth that actually being with you felt grounding. That they laughed more around you. feedback, that you didn't ask them to be anything other than who they were, that you created a space where they could breathe, even if they didn't know how to breathe in it yet, feedback, but they couldn't access that when you were there because they were in survival mode. You were too close, too present, too real. It's a bit like when you're holding your breath underwater. Model feedback. When you're down there, all you can think about is the surface. You're not appreciating the stillness or the beauty of the moment. You just want to escape feedback. But when you finally come up and take that breath, then you can look back and realize, wow, that was actually kind of beautiful. That's what happens to the avoidant. Your presence, feedback, when it was constant, felt like something they needed to get space from. But once they're no longer in it, they can finally recognize what it was. And in many cases, feedback, it was exactly what they wanted all along. That's the paradox. They crave connection just like anyone else. They want closeness. They want someone to understand them, to hold them back, to make them feel seen. But the moment it starts to feel real, their old wiring kicks in. That instinct that says, don't let anyone in too close. You might lose yourself. You might get hurt. Feedback. You might disappoint them or feedback. They might disappoint you. But when you're gone, when you're no longer there to trigger that internal alarm, what's left is the memory of how you made them feel. Feedback. And that memory is almost always softer than the reality they created in their head while you were present. Now they can romanticize it. Now they can appreciate it. Feedback. Now they can actually feel what they were too scared to feel before. Safe, calm, understood. And this is where a lot of people get confused. They think, well, if they miss me now, feedback, does that mean they've changed? Are they ready now? Not necessarily. Missing you and being ready for you are two very different things. Feedback, recognizing the safety you brought and knowing how to receive it are two separate skill sets. And unless they've done the work to heal those internal triggers, feedback, they'll likely repeat the same pattern even if you let them back in. But make no mistake, your presence did something. It left a mark. It reached them. Feedback. Even if it couldn't fully land in the moment. And now that you're gone, they feel what they couldn't feel when they had you. Feedback. If you've ever been caught in one of those on again, off again dynamic, someone who seems emotionally unavailable, you've probably felt the intense frustration of the push-pull cycle. Feedback, it's confusing. 1 week they're warm, engaged, maybe even talking about the future. And the next, cold, distant, vague. Feedback. You start to feel like you're being yanked back and forth emotionally, and you are. But here's the part that throws people off the mosting every time you start to pull away. Feedback. They start coming back. The moment you detach, they seem interested again. It makes you wonder if it's all in your head, if you're overthinking it, but it's not. That cycle is real. Feedback. And for someone with an avoidant attachment style, it actually fuels a strange kind of attraction. Avoidants have a deep fear of closeness, but that doesn't mean they don't want connection. Feedback. It means they're stuck in this tug of war between desire and fear. They're drawn intimacy just like everyone else, but when it starts to feel too real, their survival instincts kick in. Feedback. The moment the relationship starts to require emotional vulnerability or consistency, it triggers this alarm in them that says, you're losing control. You're becoming dependent. Feedback. You're going to get hurt. And so to protect themselves, they create distance. They pull away emotionally, physically, sometimes even by sabotaging the connection altogether. Feedback. But here's the irony. When you start to back off, when you stop chasing, stop pouring your energy into fixing things, stop emotionally reaching for them, they start to feel that distance too. Feedback. And suddenly you become the one who's slightly out of reach. That's when their desire is triggered, not because they've resolved their fears, but because the emotional balance has shifted. Feedback. Now you're no longer the person trying to too close, you're the one walking away. And that dynamic, as unhealthy as it sounds, becomes oddly magnetic. Feedback. That back and forth is what creates intense emotional highs and lows. The reckoning after distance, the sudden emotional bursts after long silences. It starts to feel intoxicating. Feedback, like maybe it means something deeper because of how dramatic it feels. But what it really is emotional unpredictability. It's chemistry born from inconsistency. Feedback. And the brain responds to inconsistency in a powerful way. When we don't know when the next reward, or in this case, the next moment of affection or connection is coming back, we become hyper-focused on getting it. This is exactly how slot machines work. The unpredictability keeps you hooked. That's why feedback, even though the relationship might be filled out in confusion, it can be incredibly hard to let go. Feedback, because it's not just the connection you're holding on to, it's the hope that the next pull will be the one that finally gives you what you want. And for the avoidant, feedback, when they feel you slipping away, it reignites that pursuit instinct. Suddenly, the fear of being engulfed by intimacy is replaced by a fear of losing something they didn't realize they valued until it started to disappear back. It's a strange emotional game of hot and cold that neither person is necessarily playing on purpose, but it plays out just the same. You get close, they get scared and pull away. Feedback, you get hurt and start to detach, and they come back, and round it goes. What makes it even more complicated is that those reconnection moments can feel really powerful. In fact, feedback, they often feel more romantic, more intense, more validating than the early days of the relationship, because now you're not just being wanted, you're being misty, You're being chased. Feedback. You're getting the emotional response you've been longing for. And that's what keeps people locked into the cycle. But that feeling of being wanted again, it's rarely sustainable. Feedback. Because what pulled them back was your distance, not a change in their capacity to connect. Feedback. And unless something shifts inside them, unless they develop the ability to sit with emotional closeness and not run from it, then as soon as you start getting close again, feedback. Their fear gets triggered all over again. They pull away. You get hurt, you pull back, they come closer. It becomes less of a relationship and more of a loop. It's not your fault. Feedback. And it's not even always their fault. It's a learned emotional dance that many people don't even realize they're performing. But the danger lies in mistaking that cycle for passion. Feedback. For believing that the intensity of the reconnect means something deeper, when in reality, it's just an emotional survival strategy playing out on both sides. Feedback. Because the moment you make yourself emotionally available again, the avoidance comfort zone gets tested. And unless they've learned to manage that internal response, they'll retreat. Feedback. Not because they don't care, but because closeness still feels unsafe. So when they come back, after disappearing, after pushing you away, it's tempting to believe it's a breakthrough. Feedback. That they've finally realized your worth. And maybe in some way they have. But without real emotional growth, they're not returning because they're ready for closeness. Feedback. They're returning because once again, you became distant enough to feel safe wanting. Feedback. One of the hardest things to accept, especially if you've been in a deep emotional connection with someone who keeps pulling away, is that sometimes feedback, the version of you that an avoidant finds the most attractive, isn't the one that's wide open and fully available. It's the version of you that's standing tall, living your life. Feedback, no longer revolving around them. It's the version of you that has emotionally detached, not out of bitterness or manipulation, but because you had to. Feedback, because you were no longer willing to make your peace depend on else's fear of intimacy. That version of you, calm, grounded. Feedback, self-contained, is often the exact moment they come back around. And it's confusing because you think, wait, you're interested in you now. After all this time, feedback. Now that I've finally stopped hoping, stopped reaching, stopped trying, and yes, that's often when it happens. But it's not magic and it's not just a coincidence. Feedback. It's because your energy has shifted. You're no longer emotionally chasing. You're no longer offering yourself up for approval. Feedback. Hoping they'll one day choose you in the way you've already been choosing them. When you stop emotionally investing in someone who isn't giving you anything real back, feedback. You stop participating in the old dance. You're no longer over-functioning to make up for their under-functioning. You're no longer sending long texts hoping to bridge the silence. Feedback. You're not asking, okay? Every time they disappear, you're just living. And maybe for the first time in a long time, you're focused on yourself again, on your joy, feedback, your passions, your peace. And that's when your absence comes felt, not just noticed, but I felt. See, an avoidant might not respond to your presence the way you wish they would, feedback, but they absolutely notice your absence. And when your emotional availability is no longer something they can lean on without reciprocating, they start to feel the shift in power. Feedback. You're no longer orbiting them. You've become your own center of gravity. It's a subtle but powerful transformation. You're no longer asking, what do they want from me? You're asking feedback. What do I want? And that change, when it's real, not performative, creates a kind of emotional self-sufficiency that's deeply attractive. Because it says feedback. I don't need you to feel whole. I care, but I'm not chasing. I'm not waiting. Avoidants often struggle with emotional intensity because they associate it with pressure or obligation. Feedback. But when you step back, when your presence is no longer loaded with emotional expectation, you start to represent something less threatening. Feedback. You become less about what they owe and more about what they missed. And that contrast is powerful because now they're not responding to emotional pressure. Feedback. They're responding to emotional clarity. Your peace starts to stand out. Your stillness becomes louder than all the effort you once poured in. And this is important, not just for them, feedback, but for you. Because when you truly detach, you don't just do it to get a reaction. You do it because your emotional health demands it. You stop waiting for them to come around. Feedback. You stop making your healing dependent on whether they ever get it. You start honoring your boundaries. You stop abandoning yourself. Feedback. And whether they come back or not becomes less of the point. But if they do come back, and many do, it's often because they're drawn to that new version of you. Feedback. The one who need them to feel okay. The one who doesn't fill the silence with over-explaining or try to shrink themselves to make the connection more comfortable. Feedback. That version of you is powerful, not because it's cold, but because it's rooted. You still cared. You just care about yourself as much as you cared about them. Feedback. There's something deeply magnetic about someone who is emotionally available to themselves, someone who doesn't chase what's unavailable, someone who's not asking for crumbs anymore, because they've learned they deserve the whole meal. And even if the avoidant doesn't fully understand what's changed, they feel it. They feel the distance, not as a punishment, feedback, but as a boundary. And that's often when they come back with curiosity, with a different tone, sometimes even with regret. But here's the thing, that return only matters if you still want it. Feedback. because you've grown now. You're no longer the person who would settle for inconsistent love or confusing connection. You've done the work. You've made space for something deeper, feedback, something mutual, something that doesn't require you to dim your emotional needs just to make someone else feel safe. So yes, they may find you more attractive now, feedback, but that's not because you played a game or followed a script. It's because you finally stopped asking for permission to be loved the way you deserve.